Dr. Asatar Bair, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on today. I sincerely do appreciate it. And I want to have you on today to talk about the economy and talk about the Great Resignation, something that's been on my mind lately. But before we get to any of that, the breaking news today on Friday is that Julian Assange, in his court case, the judge has ruled that he can be extradited to the US, which obviously is a big disappointment for proponents of free speech and journalism. I'm just wondering, just to get us started off, if you have any kind of thoughts on this and what this means for the free press.
I don't think we have much of a free press, to be honest. I mean, WikiLeaks was, a real step forward because here we're, using the internet, using decentralized technology to, deliver us information that the authorities would rather keep hidden. So it's certainly it's a blow to that effort, what has happened to Assange, certainly. But like in the grand scheme of things, I think that that's a kind of tinkering around the margins, basically. Like WikiLeaks doesn't give us a free press. I mean, the press is owned by a handful of billionaires, right? So, we have a very pro-business, pro-capitalist press, a press that lies continuously, that suppresses all kinds of important information, that keeps us focused on completely the wrong things, right? So, I would take a little bit of issue with the idea that we started with a free press and now we don't have one. I think, we need to create that. Is basically what the pressing need is. There are some hopeful signs. I mean, I think that there's a lot of people doing good work, doing good podcasts, doing good YouTube programs, and so on. And I mean, this is why I come on and try to support these efforts.
And I sincerely do appreciate that. And I guess what's most disconcerting is the fact that the corporate media seems to either not be covering the case to begin with, or tacitly kind of cheering on the prosecution of Assange, which is further disappointing because I think there was a period of time in the early 2010s when Assange, he was somewhat accepted by that class. He would appear on Real Time with Bill Maher. And I think that, just politically, probably the 2016 election is what turned a lot of those folks against Assange. At least that would be my assessment. So, but at the same time, I kind of wonder, don't you think that a lot of these folks do have to see that this is putting themselves at risk to some degree if they were to break a story that would, if they were to break a story that were to upset the US government, that they could find themselves being prosecuted in the same way? I mean, doesn't have to kind of be in the back of their mind?
Maybe, I don't know. It seems like the press is so beaten into submission, that I don't see a lot of, courageous investigative journalists who are challenging the powers that be, like I just don't see that. And yeah, if they were out there, maybe that would be chilling for them. But I think if we rely too much on solidarity among media figures, I just don't think that there's not that much of that. It's pretty thin. But yeah, it would seem like anyone in the media should be concerned, that they could face a kind of similar thing. But I think, just the extent of the kind of smear campaign against Assange, that he is widely seen as a sex offender,
Well, those charges were dropped too. Like after he was arrested for this, like it was just a means to an
but it's
end.
the perception, right? I mean, that's what kind of smear campaigns do. They create this perception, or that he was widely depicted as being, living in these filthy conditions in the embassy and so on. So I think that he's been othered, like by that kind of process, and I think that people in the media don't see him necessarily as one of them anymore. I don't know. That's my thought on it.
Well, again, one reason I wanted to have you on today is because I personally ended up quitting my day job recently, and it was a job that I've been at for 2 years, and it's paying the bills, so I stayed at it for a while, even though I didn't enjoy the work and thought the management was completely incompetent. But recently, I kind of had enough of that, decided to quit, and it seems as though a lot of folks are doing the same thing as part of what's being called the Great Resignation. This has been in the headlines for months, and I've seen some headlines saying that it's going to get worse after some folks, get bonuses, or after the holidays. Potentially in January we could be seeing more of this. I'm just wondering, from a Marxist economic perspective, is this predictable? Is there kind of a underlying foundation for why this is happening? Is this really just a result of COVID and people like taking inventory for their lives and what's important for them? I'm just wondering what your general thoughts are on the Great Resignation.
There's some I think of it as kind of part of a whole set of interesting dynamics that are going on in the labor market. You know, so I would date it back to like the Great Recession, right, which begins at the end of 2008. And the Great Recession sees about 10 million people drop out of the labor force, right? Now that's a pretty big number. The labor force is, little at the time, a little bit shy of 160 million people, right? So 10 million people dropping out of the labor force, it's like a pretty big deal, right? Now, some of them were boomers who retired, right? So, okay, that's fine, right? But people retire. And the boomers like this big demographic, right? So it exerts a lot of weight, right? We've been hearing about this for years and years, right? We're sick of hearing about the boomers, but there's several million people. There's maybe like 5-6 million people who are not accounted for by that, right? Maybe 7 million people dropped out of the labor force and either didn't return or were very slow to return, or only a portion of them returned. And then we see this again in COVID. I mean, millions of jobs lost, the biggest, employment losses ever recorded in the data, right, going back to the late 40s. So just remarkable. Then we had the economy kind of came roaring back, but not all those jobs came back. Not everyone came back to work. The labor force participation numbers, very, very low. So a lot of people are struggling one way or another with the labor market in the United States. And, why is this? I think, like Marxism gives the answer of class conflict, right? I mean, like that's the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, right? Well, not the opening lines, but it's early in there, right? The history of hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle, right? So we know that capitalism has this dynamic, right? It's constantly seeking to lower the wage, right? Because all things being equal, you lower the wage and you raise profits, right? So we have this crisis of low wage employment, and then we have people looking at it and saying, well, is the risk of getting COVID, does it justify the low wage and no benefits that I'm receiving, right? In the context of, well, we have much more generous unemployment compensation for a while, right? I mean, that's now being phased out. And then people, I think, start thinking more broadly about, well, what are my options here? What else could I be doing? And some people have more options than others. Some people are able to take advantage of the new technology or the new opportunities. Through, it's much easier to get into media now, I think, than it's ever been, right? And to raise money for that, like through Patreon or other means, right? But this is a minority of people who are able to do that. I'm not sure if that's your situation, but this is a minority.
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't quite pay the bills. I guess the one thing, just personally, my perspective on that from media, like for independent media, I personally think I've suffered a lot of censorship, and like my channel was demonetized for like a year on YouTube. Wow. Basically. Yeah. And videos get throttled, videos get demonetized. So I mean that's a whole nother aspect of it. But I do see what you're saying, where folks that do have different options depending on who they are.
Yeah, and that's great, right? I mean, like we have, this is a very diversified kind of economy in the United States, right? It's a wealthy country. There are people have a variety of different options, but there's lots of people who don't have those options as well, right? I mean, we lose track of that, I think, because the reality is that the voices of the more privileged are just overwhelming, right? I mean, and that's true across the board, right? Not just the 1%, but like, kind of much deeper into like the 10%, or the educated worker is far more likely to be heard than the worker who is less educated, and so on, right? So I think if we just go by media reflections of what is the average person, what is their situation, we get a very, very skewed picture, right? Um, what it seems to me, I mean, my own work, I focus a lot more on those toward the bottom of the income distribution. And what I see there is tremendous strain. I mean, wages are low. Many people lack health insurance. We have this massive looming eviction crisis. People are very deeply in debt. A lot of people are struggling and do not have the option to leave their job, either because they're just living paycheck to paycheck, they have no savings, or because they have some kind of health care coverage, even if it's not very good coverage, right? Even if it gives them lots of gaps, it's still, they consider it better than nothing, or they need that coverage for whatever reason. So I think a lot of people feel very, very trapped in their low wage employment, and some people, I think, are taking advantage of the new openness around COVID to kind of ask some of those bigger questions. Is it worth it to try to climb this ladder? What do I have to give up in order to do that? And I think the media sort of looks for these trends, right, and says, let's try to name that. So I think that's what this phrase, the Great Resignation, comes from. That's my take on it, at least.
One thing that I have noticed come up in my Facebook feed a lot is people sharing images of fast food restaurants like Wendy's or Burger King or Dunkin' Donuts, where there's signs up saying we're closed today because we didn't have enough staff or something like that. So, and I've seen, videos on Twitter of people saying where the whole Wendy's staff all decided to quit at the same time. Is this a trend that is happening, that maybe is part of the Great Resignation? Is this something different? Just what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I mean, is there a real trend here? Is it kind of run of the mill class conflict, right? Is there something unique about this particular moment? I think the pandemic has underlined for people that there was a hope that capitalism in the United States might turn towards a more social democratic kind of form, like a more of a Norway type of model, right? Because, this is Bernie's whole thing, and AOC, and right, this is the kind of, acceptable version of socialism that has been talked about a lot. But I think the pandemic, a lot of people took a look around and said, we're not close to getting healthcare during a pandemic. When the hell would we ever get it then, right? I mean, this is like code red kind of moment. Um, and I think it seems to a lot of people, I mean, I certainly include myself in this, that the elites really have very little interest in human welfare in the slightest. I mean, they certainly have an interest in keeping power, right? And if that's threatened, then they'll probably make some concessions. But you know, given that there isn't a real threat right now, there's no one's in the street, this is not a moment like, say, last summer. Um, well, then there's not going to be any concessions, despite that, very strong supermajorities want everyone to have healthcare, right?
And I guess
And that's true on the Republican side.
well, that's what I find, I guess, most confusing is the fact that we're seeing this austerity and all of these COVID, welfare, like the added income supplements, and also in a couple months with student loan payments. This is something that just confuses me, where, especially from a political perspective, just given that the election is coming up in less than a year, that you're going to be having 45 million people in the US have to start making a new monthly payment that they haven't been making in 2 years. That seems kind of like political suicide for the Democrats. But more broadly, with this level of austerity, it just, I guess I'm just wondering what their thinking is. Like, are they trying to see how far they can push the envelope before people start rioting in the streets?
I don't know that the Democrats, I mean, their whole thing is to appear at once bumbling, like when it comes to, like we're trying our best, right? But at the same time, they try to present themselves as the educated technocratic elite, that segment, right? And the Republicans have taken on a different kind of vibe, right? Like they're like, govern schmovern, right? I mean, like, who cares about governing? Government sucks, right? I mean, that's their vibe. but they don't present themselves as a technocratic elite either. They present themselves as, ordinary Joes that are fighting for you, this sort of thing, right? Um, but of course, the reality is that neither party does this, right? Both parties are very reliable servants of capital. They just have a different style and they play back and forth between each other, right? So, to say that the Democrats want to even win, I'm not convinced of that. I think that the Democrats would be very happy to lose. There's not much at stake for them. A senator that loses becomes a lobbyist, right? Like, I mean, that's a well-trodden path. Um, so, I don't know that how hard they really try. I think it's a kind of professional wrestling style, kind of thing that, depends on us all believing it.
I completely agree. I don't know how many times I've said over the years politics is pro wrestling. So I'm glad
Right.
glad to hear you say that. But yeah, I mean, just from the perspective of how far they can push society, again, like I wonder, because it seems as though there are some cracks emerging. And again, maybe I'm wrong, maybe that's part of the theater, but when you see stores closing, or restaurants saying that they can't open because they don't have enough staff, or it seems as though some businesses are very eagerly trying to find people to employ without raising wages. I don't know, it just seems as though things are just getting worse and worse and worse, and there's more fuel being added to the fire. And I just would think, from the perspective of the of the elite, like, why would they, like, wouldn't they want to throw some more breadcrumbs to try to keep people, again, from protesting or striking?
I think there's a certain kind of wise management of the economy. Like, if you like capitalism, maybe you should sort of try to manage its excesses a little bit. Um, but I think the difficulty with that is that you need a real strong leadership in order to do that, right? I mean, because there's a lot of, like, whenever you try to manage some aspect of capitalism, you're gonna step on somebody's toes, right? I mean, like, and that's the problem, right? I mean, like, yeah, what are the obstacles to giving everyone healthcare, just from a business perspective, right? Like, which segments of the capitalist marketplace are you going to piss off if you try to give everyone healthcare? Well, the problem is it's pretty expensive if you continue to shovel vast amounts of money toward the pharmaceutical industry, right? So, if you step on drug prices, which you need to do, right? Which every country that has, socialized medicine does, right? Well, you're going to piss off a very powerful pharmaceutical industry, right? Um, not to mention, any kind of healthcare reform is going to step on the health insurance industry, right? So, even though, like, there's plenty of segments of capitalist business that want everyone to have healthcare because the premiums are killing them, like, they're like, I mean, my employer, I'll just give you an example, right? My employer is Riverside Community College District. Okay. So I live and work in Southern California, and I get a statement on my paycheck every month, right? And we have a very strong union, our faculty union. I've been very honored to be able to contribute that in a pretty minor capacity. I was treasurer for a number of years, but our union has given us great benefits. We don't pay for it, right? The college pays, the district pays on our behalf, right? So and what it says on my paycheck is the benefits that you receive for the family plan or whatever add up to something like $4,000, right? $4,000, that's a lot of money, right? I mean, like, that's a crazy amount of money. I mean, that is, that, like, over the course of a year, I mean, that could be somebody's job right there, right? I mean, so I think plenty of employers are like, what is going on? Like, we are paying, the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry. This is crazy, right? There would be plenty of business support for nationalized healthcare, but it would take strong leadership because you're going to have to step on some very powerful businesses, right? And these businesses contribute a lot, right? So how do you manage like, capitalism does not have a unified aim or will, right? I mean, that's part of the problem, right? So for us to act like it, for us to say, hey, doesn't it seem kind of irrational to step on workers so hard that you push them to the brink? Like, yeah, that is kind of irrational, right? But the entire system's irrational. Like, so you have so many different fractures here. And I think that this is one of the great contributions of Marxism, is to say, capitalism does not have, it's not as unified as people think, there's plenty of struggles and contradictions between capitalists, right? Um, I don't know if you watch this show, Succession. I've been into this show lately, but this is like a picture of, what it's about though, right?
No.
It's about this wealthy family. They're kind of like a combination between like Rupert Murdoch and like the Waltons or something, super rich billionaire. They have a media company and they own whatever. And so it's about the family, and it's about the dynamics and who's going to take over for the dad who's getting older and blah blah blah, right? But what it really reveals to me, at least as a Marxist, as a communist watching this, I'm, on the one hand, I'm kind of disgusted by watching the lives of the very rich, but on the other hand, the show savages the rich also, like it shows how venal they are and how kind of pointless is a lot of their spending, and how they care mostly about power, and have very few principles. And it's a fascinating show on that level, but it also shows how much competition and jockeying there is between these different segments, like between finance, for example, and media or productive enterprise. So kind of a fascinating look on that level.
Something else that's been in the headlines lately is inflation, and we're hearing that inflation is here to stay. And obviously, I think most people concede some of that in their daily lives, where groceries just week to week seem to be costing more and more. Um,
Absolutely.
what is driving this inflation, and where do you think this is going to go? Over the course of the next year or so.
I think there's no question what's causing it, and it's the about $10 trillion of new money that was created in the last 2 years. Um, that's a lot of new money, right? And it's created in the form of a massive expansion of federal government bonds, right? So we have about 5 trillion there, right? And the other part of it is just a massive expenditure on the part of the Federal Reserve, right? So the Fed buys all kinds of different assets, right? And where does it get the money to do this, right? The money is created out of thin air, So how does this then translate? A lot of these are financial assets, right? So what the Fed buys is, they went on this huge buying spree in order to stabilize markets after, the great crash, the Great Recession, right? Um, and how does this then, if they're buying, stocks, bonds, derivatives like mortgage-backed securities, things like this, how does that then turn into an increase in the price of milk, right? Because I mean, aren't these like completely different and separate realms, right? Like finance and gas prices or whatever. Well, no, they're not completely separate, right? Because like when you accumulate money in financial markets, okay, you might leave it there for a while, but the purpose of money is ultimately to buy things, right? I mean, like at some point, you're going to take your fictional wealth that's on paper, right? And you're going to liquidate it and you're going to buy things with it. So it's inevitable that when you by trillions of dollars, right, expand the money supply, even if its immediate target is financial markets, and that's the first place that it flows into, which is absolutely the case, right? But eventually, it's going to flow out of financial markets because that's the point of money, right? I mean, the point of money is to purchase goods and services. Um, you might want to accumulate for a while. It might take a while to transfer, to rising prices. I mean, a $10 trillion expansion in the money supply, which is what this is maybe about a 50% increase in the money supply. So to say it's translated into about a 6% increase in prices just shows us that the correspondence is not exact. It's not immediate, right? Like it's not like, okay, you've vastly and dramatically increased the money supply and you immediately and automatically get the same amount of inflation. Not quite, right? It's a more complicated than that. But I think the end result is undeniable, which is, you cannot create trillions of new dollars of new money and have no effect on prices whatsoever. And anyone who says that that's possible, I mean, I just think like that's not true. I mean, there's not going to be an exact correspondence, and it's not going to be instantaneous, but there's going to be some kind of effect, right? And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think it's very interesting that the media never gives that as an explanation. They say, well, it's, oh, the consumers are feeling better. Or they say, oh, well, a lot of volatility in energy prices, whatever. This is nonsense. I mean, like, okay, there's volatility in prices, yes, but that's not what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about volatility. We're talking about an overall increase that affects pretty much everything, right? And it affects things differently, yes. Some things are more volatile than others, we know this. The problem is that the level of prices has gone up, right? I mean, that's what the measurement indicates, right? It's not about volatility, it's about everything costs, 6% more on average than it used to, right? And are we all getting paid 6% more, right?
Right. I mean, and that was going to be my next question too, is do you think that this will inevitably result in higher wages? Just because, I mean, if groceries are costing more and more every time you're going to the supermarket, but your paycheck is the same, or you're going to get a 1% raise this year, again, that just seems like more pressure on the working class that's going to be, potentially leading to strikes or just other kind of social unrest.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the undeniable and immediate effect is it just makes people's lives worse, right? I mean, like it makes the life harder, if gas costs you $5 or $10 more to fill up your gas tank, that's money that you don't have for other things, right? And it's not very easy to get the way that our transportation infrastructure, heavily car reliant, right? It's not that easy to switch to something else, right? It's not that easy to say, oh, I'll just buy an electric vehicle or whatever, right? Like most people don't have that ability, right? Because, well, the electric vehicles are very expensive, right? Or new cars are expensive, and by the way, because of the supply chain issues, new cars are kind of hard to get these days, right? So, there's all these things that I think signal that just the immediate effect of the price increases is, yes, workers' lives get worse. Will that translate into higher wages later? Probably there will be some of that, right? Because the fact seems to be that there's a lot of what they call labor shortages, right? I mean, and the well-known antidote to that problem is to simply raise wages.
But they're seemingly not doing that though, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the last thing they want to do, right? They want to, I mean, this is why you see all over the place, right? They say, we need a manager, big signing bonus, right? They would rather give you a lump sum payment than have a higher wage, because a lump sum payment is a one-time thing. They understand that, right? That's on the books one time, right? Higher wages are an expense that's ongoing, right? So, businesses don't like that, right? And they're sort of taking advantage of people's desperation, like, oh, hey, I would like to have that signing bonus, right? I need money now, right? Of course. So I think there is going to be somewhat of a translation into higher wages, but is it going to keep pace? That's harder to say. I think that depends more on how strong labor is, right? Are people organized? Are people, is everyone on their own to navigate the capitalist labor market? Or, is there some kind of organized effort? Workers do better when there's an organized effort. That's what we see historically.
Unfortunately, it seems as though the establishment does everything they possibly can to prevent that and disrupt that. So
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I just had Danny Haifong on recently, and this is one thing that he really pointed to when talking about this is, the Great Resignation, or these instances of restaurants and whatnot shutting down. It seems as though that's really disrupted, a disrupted effort to kind of circumvent what's happening. But there is no real organization among workers to kind of fight back against this. So you have kind of like these one-off things happening all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, you have the labor movement, and you have unionization in some areas and some sectors, and that's good. I'd love to see a lot more of that. It has the feeling a little bit these days, I think, that if you find a unionized job, you're kind of in a minority there, right? Like, unionization rates are, at historic lows in the United States.
Like 10%, right?
Roughly. Yeah. So, this is, and this is the result of decades of class struggle against workers, against union organizers, and so, but the efforts continue. I mean, we saw this with Amazon. We see this, in the very first Starbucks that was recently was unionized. So, we have to support these efforts, right? I think, every worker should have a union, right? I mean, that's my basic position. Your union is your protection, and it stands between you and the power of the employer. I mean, I think almost all of us, who work for an employer have a lot more to lose than the employer does, if they fire us, right? I mean, of course they're going to lose, right? It costs money to find a new person. But, it's, it's very difficult for the person who's lost their job, right? So, and things like raises and benefits and working conditions, all these things, right? These are all the product of negotiation. So, it's good to kind of keep that in mind. And there's a reason why the capitalist class is always against this, right? Always tries to, change the law to make this more difficult, right? And we've seen that. I've seen that in my own sector, in academic employment. A lot of things have shifted to adjunct, right? To part-time, far lower wages. I mean, it's not wage contract employment, so it's not wage in terms of dollars per hour exactly, but it's it's lower pay and lower benefits, right? I mean, that's the formula. So, and like I said, I mean, this is a dehumanizing system, a system that cares about wealth far more than it does about human life.
So just going back to inflation, obviously I'm not asking you to make any predictions, but I'm just curious for your perspective on what you think the end result will be, from the Federal Reserve, from the government. Do you think this is going to result in, higher interest rates in the short term? Do you think that, there are going to be any kind of maybe like rollback of the austerity to kind of provide more social safety nets, just again because prices are rising? Like, what do you think their response to the inflation is going to be?
I think we have an interesting, yeah, it's really, well, it's hard to say, right? Is there going to be rising rates? There might be some rising rates. Rates are low and they've been low for a long time. So that's interesting, like when we look at the aftermath of the Great Recession and we see rates being, basically dropped to zero and then left there much longer than we'd ever seen before, even though the economy is supposedly recovering. I think it also kind of shows you that what the Fed does with interest rates really has very little relationship with the overall what's happening with inflation. It has very little relationship with even with bank lending, the thing that it's supposed to affect. For people who have taken like the basic Keynesian economics that's in like introductory macroeconomics, we're told, and this is followed up by every article in the business press. They tell, well, the Fed controls interest rates, and they do that as a way of controlling inflation. And you might look around and say, how come we always have inflation then, right? I mean, like whether rates are high or low, there's always a baseline of inflation. And why is that, right? Why should prices grow 2% a year? I mean, 2% a year is considered low inflation, right?
Right.
Why should prices grow 2% a year? Like we're not really encouraged to ask that question broadly, right? I mean, the answer that I would give is, look, we have a banking system that's very decentralized. The Fed is not the only institution that creates money. Money gets created whenever credit is created, right? So how many places are there that create credit? I don't know, a zillion, right? I mean, like there's a lot of credit floating around in the economy, right? And does the Fed control that? Do interest rates control that? Not really, right? I mean, like at best, they have an influence on it. But that influence doesn't always flow in the direction that we think. And especially at weird times, right? Like COVID, for example, that's a pretty weird time, or the Great Recession, weird time. You lower rates to zero, but banks don't start lending again. What banks do is they accumulate $2.5 trillion in excess reserves. That's off the map in terms of Like if you take intro to macro, what you learn is, when the Fed lowers interest rates, oh, the banks say, okay, well, we will lend more of our reserves and that will create more money. And, then, okay, right. So that's the opposite of that happened in the Great Recession, right? Banks were terrified. And so they didn't loans dried up, right? And this is a big reason why the recession was so deep and it hit so hard, right? There were all these businesses, about 80% of business investment is finance, right? So all these businesses could not invest because they relied on that financing. They thought that they had these lines of credit and so on, right? They thought that there was not going to be a problem because, it's an ordinary business for them, right? But all of a sudden there was a problem. All of a sudden the loans are not available. And the same thing happened to millions of consumers, right? The credit line that you thought you had on your credit card, well, that went away, right? So this is banks destroying money, right? I mean, this is literally what it's called in economic theory, is money destruction. Even though rates were at historic lows, money destruction was occurring to the tune of trillions of dollars. So, the idea that the Fed, carefully calibrates, they step on the gas, they ease off the gas or whatever, yeah, as a way of controlling inflation rates, I think is just absolute nonsense. I wonder whose interests are served by that narrative, actually, right? Because, what we have is we have, you know, even during low inflation, we have the money supply continues to expand, right? So what is going to happen moving forward? That's a little bit harder to say. I think the Fed would love to raise rates, but they're always concerned. Well, how is that going to affect financial markets? How is that going to affect consumer credit? How is that going to affect all these other rates, which move together with it? And they might well. I mean, rates might continue to stay at historic lows. They might move up a little bit, right? I mean, they've moved up a little bit from their. If we look at mortgage rates, for example, they've moved up a little bit. Mortgage rates are still incredibly low. So, what does that mean for the average person? When rates are low, it's like credit is a little bit cheaper, right? You can refinance and whatever. And this is what's been keeping, I think, a lot of, American households afloat, which is, we have access to debt at an extent that we haven't had, before about 1980 or so, right? So for the last, it's about 40-year period, right? Credit has become much more available to the average household. And we've used that to, deal with the fact that wages are also much lower, like once they're adjusted for inflation, right? They're much lower. So I think that system kind of works for the financial sector. And I think they wouldn't mind seeing that kind of return. But I mean, it's very hard to say. I guess we'll see, right?
Well, and I guess that was another question that I had also. When you have rates so low and you have inflation so high, I mean, that can turn into effectively like a negative interest rate, right? Like I've seen people saying,
Real terms, yeah.
like now's the time to take out a mortgage because you're effectively getting paid to have a mortgage. If inflation's 7% and the interest rate is 3%, so you have a negative interest rate. So I mean, is that kind of a silver lining? I mean, obviously, there's if your wage is worth less and less every week or every month, obviously that's a bad thing. But should people? I mean, is this the time for people to be taking out more loans because they're effectively, getting paid to do so?
I would ask the question, is it money that you can use, right? Because so the average person has one home if they own a home, right? They have one home, and so if that home goes up in value, how does that help you, right? I mean, like you could borrow against it, right? You can withdraw the home equity. And lots of people have done that, right? That's kept afloat millions of households, right? But the problem with withdrawing equity is, you might end up paying more there, right? Or you might just never pay off the house, right? Because if you keep on, or if the house goes up in value, you take out the equity, right? You're on track to like never pay it back, right? Well, that's a certain kind of precariousness, isn't it? Because if you pay off your house, if you lose your job, then you're not going to lose your house, right? I mean, like there's a certain security in that, I mean, we know that looking back like 1960s, 1950s, people had a very different attitude about like refinancing, about second mortgages or third mortgages, right? Which is basically you would never do that unless it was an absolute life or death thing, right? And people would throw parties when they paid off their mortgage, right?
Right.
Because you're finally out from under the bank. You're not, I mean, the amount of interest, the amount of accumulated interest that you pay on a mortgage is absolutely huge, right?
Right.
And I think we're not really encouraged to do the math. So the only really way that you can profit, bottom line answer to this question, the only really way that you can profit from negative real interest rates is if you're a real estate speculator, or if you're a real estate developer, and that's who really benefits from it. If it's your own personal house, it's hard to see like a real lasting benefit unless you trade down. I mean, this is something that like, my parents did, right? My parents had a, big expensive house. They lived in Marin County in California. And then, real estate boom proceeded and they downsized and bought a much cheaper house. And then, they took the proceeds from that and, invested in whatever, right? So, maybe there's a way that you can sort of tinker around the edges, but in general, if you're staying in your house, it's very hard to see how you're going to get a real lasting benefit. Probably what's going to happen is that your level of risk and your level of leverage creep up. You know what I mean by that, right? Like,
Sure. Let's move away from mortgages per se. Like, what if you took
okay,
out a credit card with 0% interest
yeah,
and you bought a bunch of electronics, and then 6 months or whatever, something that you could sell for theoretically the same amount or more in the future? Like, wouldn't that be a way to kind of navigate the inflation?
it's possible. Yes, you could use loans to essentially buy low and sell high through a variety of means. Maybe by reselling consumer products, maybe through financial markets, right? But it's risky, right? I mean, all these things are. So, and this is what leverage is, right? Leverage is using debt to magnify returns, right? So, does it create possibilities? Yes, it can, but it's also very risky, right? So I wouldn't say that in general it offers a very good answer for the average person. I would say maybe, like if you're sophisticated, if you know something about this, if you know something about arbitrage, basically, maybe, like, and you're willing to take a risk, right? Then maybe you can do that. But is that going to help the average person? I think the average person is very clear what becomes of them with a 0% introductory rate, which is that they, just get in debt,
Hmm.
and then the rate ends. And, they needed that money to fix their car or to, right, for basically a necessary expense, something that should be covered in a just society, should be covered, but isn't,
Hmm.
I think that's where that kind of average person is. But hey, more power to you. If you can figure out a way to borrow at a negative rate and make something out of it. Mostly what we see is that the big investment houses, right? The big real estate developers that tend to benefit from low rates, as far as in my observation.
So one question around this subject that I've always had is about monetary policy in the Soviet Union. I don't know if you can speak to that at all. Just how was the money supply managed? How was money created in the Soviet Union?
Well, they had they had a nationalized banking system, so they did not have private banks which they were beholden to. In a lot of ways it's similar. I mean, they also had fiat money, right? So they managed it a little bit differently. They didn't, like I say, they're not beholden to banks that are taking on additional risks and then require periodic bailouts. um, so, I mean, they had a kind of similar. Um, I mean, there's a lot of this history here. So there were times where they did dramatically increase the money supply for various reasons, right?
Like World War II, I imagine, probably.
Yeah, right. Especially early on, and it caused huge amounts of inflation. The Czar also did this, So like World War One, the Czar, there was something like 300% inflation or something like this, right? So this is one of the struggles and contradictions that led to the Russian Revolution, even, right? It's just the fact that, there's a massive expansion in the cost of living, and people's wages are not necessarily keeping pace with that. People are, some people are managing to profit from this, right? Because people always do sometimes. But a lot of people also end up getting screwed by it. And, whenever inflation is that high, there's the potential for you to get screwed much harder by it, than, 6% is one thing, right? 300% is a whole other thing.
Well,
I
I
don't know if
guess,
this answers the question exactly.
well, I guess, yeah, just kind of wondering how in a non-capitalist society, how money is created. And I know that in a different interview, you mentioned E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful. And I've interviewed people on the show previously, from Berkshires who've created these different local currencies throughout the country. So I guess I'm
Wow.
just wondering, what you would say would be the ideal solution for creating money, if there is one, or at least a much better one. Is it having these small local currencies? Is it having a strong central bank or public banking? Like, what do you think would be a vast improvement over what we have right now?
I think that the financial system, it can support or it can undermine the productive part of the economy, right? And what I see happening in the United States right now, we have this kind of ongoing process of financialization, right? Where the productive economy is getting more and more hollowed out, right? Finance, real estate, right? These sectors are going gangbusters, um, and things like manufacturing, right? A much lower percentage, even though, of course, because of the growth of the economy, there's more value produced, but the percentage is much lower, right? The percentage of the economy. So, this is interesting, right? All the outsourcing, has moved manufacturing away from the United States and has moved a lot of productive activity. And I'm talking productive in the Marxist sense, right? Does it produce value directly? Does it produce surplus value? Or does it subsist off that surplus value that has been produced elsewhere, right? So finance takes a cut of the surplus, right? And that's what interest is if it's being charged to a productive business, right? So I don't mean productive as a value judgment. I just mean it as a a theoretically descriptive term, right? So the question is like how does our existing system encourage that financialization, right? And there's all sorts of different ways. So would it be better to slow that down? Would it be better for capitalism? That's not my primary interest, I have to say, right? I think you could probably make a case for that, and other people have. My interest is more about how do you create an economy that gives everyone a decent life, and is there a way to structure the financial part of things so that is facilitated? I think there is, right? But if you're asking me the question, what would be a better way of doing money, finance, credit, better for what, right? Like better to support the capitalism that we have now? I'm not really going to answer that. But if it's about like, well, how could we, under a socialist system, right, under a system where we take the well-being of the average person as a primary goal, right? Not, how can we help capitalists expand value, right? Well, that's a different story, right? Well, then we could do very different things, Then money becomes more of a tool for us rather than we're a tool for money. I mean, I think that's kind of our situation now.
Just one other, kind of macroeconomic question that I have, and again, this goes back to the student loans, because again, on February 1st, people who have not been making student loan payments for 2 years are supposed to start making them again.
Right.
And from my perspective, I think that there's probably a lot of people who, out of that 45 million, who have not been making payments for the last couple of years, or those who have not been making payments out of that 45 million, they've probably been using that money, to speculate in different things. The cost of collectibles has gone through the roof the last couple of years, like sports cards and trading cards, comic books, like key issues of comic books featuring the first appearances of superheroes and whatnot. Those have gone through the roof.
Mhm.
Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, obviously that has gone and continued to go up over the last couple of years. It seems as though when these people have to start making payments again, they're probably going to start selling off a lot of these things, and that could create, a chain reaction of bubbles popping. That's just sort of, a theory that I have as somebody who's not really an economist. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that. Do you think that that's a real possibility, or do you think that it's unlikely?
Um, yeah, it's certainly a possibility. I mean, that's the way that these bubbles work. I mean, new money flowing into that market is going to cause a more rapid rise in prices than what the fundamentals dictate, right? So, we see that everywhere from Bitcoin to stocks to like the collectibles that you
Yeah,
mentioned.
the meme stocks as well. Like that was probably a major beneficiary of, people having
Yeah,
some extra money.
right. Um, and there's also a kind of a desire there, I think, to sort of stick it to the man, or stick it to like the these hedge fund traders or whatever, right?
Yep.
Um, and that's sort of interesting. But in terms of the overall thing, like the GameStop or AMC stuff, it doesn't really depart from the pattern where you have people like boosting things, right? Boosting stocks or boosting crypto or, you know, boosting Tesla. I mean, like that's probably the greatest booster that we have right now is Elon Musk. I mean, that's his genius. He's a genius level booster. Um, I don't think he's a genius at anything else, but he's really good at getting attention and boosting stuff. Um, and like that's all bubble behavior. I mean, and that kind of behavior is at least 400 years old, so I don't think that there's something new happening here. The fact that Reddit is involved is a little bit new, but I mean, people have been talking to one another, whether in real life or whatever, or in different fashion for hundreds of years. So some of those might collapse. I mean, whenever I see things like that, though, I think, might this be kind of hidden inflation? Like, because I talked about all of that money that's floating around, right? Might that flow into alternative assets? Might some of that flow into Bitcoin? Like from, say, stocks. Like, might some investors have gotten money from the Fed, right, either directly or indirectly, and then said, let me diversify, crypto's really hot right now, let me get into that, right? And then that money inflates Bitcoin, right? Because I mean, what is Bitcoin at right now? $45,000 or something like this?
Around 50, I think.
Yeah, I don't follow it closely, but you know, um, this is the influence of new money flowing into this market, right? So, is it possible that that collapses? Yeah, I think it is, because crypto is a kind of red hot market, and there's red hot markets have one place to go, right? Which is they cool, and as they cool, money leaves them, and then the prices fall. I don't know that that's because of student loan payments, though. I mean, I think I would. I don't have any data on this because I haven't looked at it, but I would think that it would be minor compared to the big institutional money.
I guess I just mean like the accessibility that people are able to buy it now, like with Robinhood and like all these different apps. And something that I've been seeing a lot of lately is gas stations where they have like these ATMs where you can purchase crypto at the gas station. I've been seeing these everywhere here in Connecticut lately. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering too, like your general thoughts on Bitcoin, because a lot of supporters of Bitcoin would say that this is a great alternative currency because it doesn't have the kind of inflation like the dollar does, right? There's a set number of Bitcoin that can be mined. It's kind of a similar argument that you hear from libertarians in support of gold or silver. So what are your just general thoughts on using Bitcoin as an actual currency and not just as a speculative asset?
Well, I'd be interested in, what problem does it solve better than existing kinds of currencies? And what it seems to offer is that it's irrevocable and anonymous. And so that's great for transactions in which you want that. And but by the way, we have something which already does that, right? If you want irrevocable and anonymous, the thing you do is you hand somebody paper money, right? As if you're in real life. So maybe you need that, though, for doing internet transactions, right? You need internet cash. Yeah, right. So okay, there's a place for it. But how many transactions do you really want to be anonymous and irrevocable? For myself, I'll tell you, probably less than 1%, like, because when, like if I buy something online, do I want it to be irrevocable? No, I want it to be revocable. I like, hey, you didn't deliver my package, dude,
Right.
like I'm going to take back the money now, like, so almost everything that you buy, you don't need that. And I don't need it to be anonymous either. Um, Unless I'm doing something illegal. Now, I'm not going to share with your viewers how often I do that, but it's a minority of the time, let's just say, right? For I think almost all of us, unless you're, a professional criminal, then you probably have a real need for it, right? So I think Bitcoin is something that should certainly exist. Cryptocurrency is a good idea, but is it going to take over the world? I haven't seen a plausible argument for that so far. Every internet transaction is already encrypted, so like you could say on that level, we're already all using cryptocurrency for every transaction, Is it better for it not to be controlled by a central bank? Yeah, central banks support kind of the worst aspects of financial capitalism. Um, but again, like if the economy was arranged for the well-being of most people, right? If we had socialism, I wouldn't be against I'm not against central banks per se, right? I'm against them being a tool of finance, which then, supports the exploitation of workers, and destroys the planet along the way, right? That's the stuff I don't like, not central banking as an institution.
So I know that we're running out of time. One other subject that I wanted to discuss with you, and that we've been seeing, a lot of people warn about in the COVID era, is the push towards automation. And I've heard this, even kind of directed towards people who are demanding higher wages, like you shouldn't be asking for higher wages because they're just going to automate your job, and you're going to have McDonald's where people just go in and order from robots.
Yep.
But I've had people on the show who've talked about, seriously, there are large companies who are planning to automate millions of jobs. And even that was really what Andrew Yang ran on, is saying there's going to be AI replacing a lot of jobs in the near future, and that's why we need UBI. Do you think that this is a real threat that the working class is facing? And if so, is the solution something like UBI?
Is it a real threat? Yeah, yeah. Automation is. I mean, that's something that we have a history of observing that. That's not a new thing, right? I mean, like in economics, it's just called substituting capital for labor, right? I mean, and we've seen that for the entire history of capitalism, and it often has destructive effects, right? It often, it reduces. It reduces the number of jobs when something is automated, or when something is, when you substitute capital for labor. Um, and Yang's whole argument was that trucking is right on the edge of automation, right?
Right.
Because of self-driving trucks it could cut in half the number of truck drivers. And there's like millions of truck drivers, right? So that's an immediate kind of threat. It's interesting to kind of ask the question, well, it's been 5 years, right? Like, I mean, what has happened to that, right? It seemed like, well, we were right on the edge of that 5 years ago, but now we have all of these supply chain issues, and where is automation? Where's the automation that we were promised, right? Like,
Mhm.
so I wonder if, the projections might be a little bit rosy there, but I think that there's no question that there's an ongoing process of automation, and that it's disorderly. You know what I mean? Like it may create some jobs, and it's certainly going to destroy some jobs. And how do we gauge that, right? Like, the number created, is it going to be greater or less than the number destroyed? It's hard to say, right? Because capitalism is disorderly that way, right? It has no particular overarching plan, right? It's like, okay, a bunch of people want to save costs, and here's what they do. I think what's misleading about it is to say that it's driven by workers' demands for higher wages. That's nonsense. Companies clearly want to automate. They want to substitute capital for labor all the time, right? Not just when workers demand more wages. Like, they want to do it anytime it's profitable, right? Like, and if it's not profitable, they don't want to do it. So, maybe that's what's holding up automation is just simply, it depends on the relative prices of capital and labor, right? So, if that balance is correct, then we're going to see that substitution. If it's not, then we're not going to see that substitution. Um, Now, with that said, if you ask me about UBI, Universal Basic Income, I think it's a good idea, but I think it's a socialist idea. I think it's a good idea if we have a social society, right? Um, Guaranteeing a minimum income to everybody, great idea. But given that we have a capitalist society, might it go in the wrong direction for us to have a UBI under those conditions? I think yes, that's quite possible. And if you listen to the way that Yang and a lot of these people talk about it, what they say is, we'll give everyone a UBI and then we'll eliminate every other form of welfare. So
Mhm.
it's hard to see it like,
That's
is
what,
that,
because Milton Friedman was a proponent of UBI, wasn't he?
yeah, right. And so it's like, is that going to be a net gain to people? I don't know. Maybe not. Like maybe it just sort of reshuffles the deck there. Um, and is that better? It's hard to see how. Like, and when you look at who's proposing it, these aren't people who are very concerned with making the average person's life better. They might be concerned with saving the government some money or streamlining things or cutting a bunch of jobs from different federal agencies, maybe. Um,
Mm.
that isn't my primary goal. Like I think if we create a society in which everyone has housing, everyone has healthcare, everyone can get education without incurring mountains of debt, right? Where everyone has the basics that ensure them a decent life, no matter what they do, just by virtue of being alive and being a human being, right? I think that is the way we should be organized in society. Now, given that we use markets, should income be a part of that? Should we also guarantee everyone a certain amount of income? I think the answer is probably yes, right? But the other things are a lot more important. Like I wouldn't say, oh, it's all about income, because well, income it depends on what things cost, right? Like, I mean, oh, we could give everyone $1 a year. Would that change your life? No, right? I mean, like that's universal basic income, but it depends on what things cost, right? I think I would much rather see something that says, look, we will not permit a single person in this country to go homeless, right? We will not permit that. That's barbaric. We can do better, right? We're not going to permit a child to go hungry. We're not going to allow there to be such a thing as school lunch debt. Can you imagine what the hell? How does this phrase exist in the richest country in the world, right? I mean, we can do a lot better than this, and we need to demand that, right? I mean, that's the only way we're going to get it.
I agree. The challenge that I see that frequently happens, and one thing that really made me politically aware was the protests against the Iraq War. And one thing that I personally saw with the anti-war movement is it's slowly getting co-opted by the Democratic Party, with Democrats slowly showing up to these protests over time. Democrats in 2006 running on, if you elect us, we're going to leave Iraq. That was really what propelled Barack Obama in 2008 as well. And then the anti-war movement effectively just went away and doesn't really exist anymore, and we're still occupying and bombing countries around the world. And I think that we've seen that with many different movements repeatedly. So one concern that I have is I don't really understand. I don't see how the working class is going to start moving in that direction without some massive disruptions, like some of the stuff we're talking about earlier, like the fact that people can't afford to buy things, so they really start like robbing stores or rioting or whatnot. But how politically can we push for actual change without it just being co-opted by a corporate party?
Well, I think we need to have the courage to talk about the details, but also talk more broadly, right? Because if we just tinker around details, if we just say, oh, we should, let's this infrastructure bill should include this or whatever, right? Like that's not enough, right? That doesn't give us a sense that like, well, what it takes to make things significantly better for people is bigger than that, right? It's not going to involve tinkering around taxes. Um, but at the same time, we can't just do the big picture stuff, right? Because there needs to be some kind of concrete level of like, well, how do you proceed? And if you get too abstract, if you say, well, I'm a communist or whatever, like well, what does that mean? Like, I mean, it can get very abstract very quickly. So
Mhm.
I think we need to, we need to communicate with one another. We need to get together, right? I mean, that's always the issue with, the working class is, this is most of us here, right? Um, and the capitalist class is a very tiny minority. They succeed by getting us all to think that we're capitalists, and but the reality is that we're not, and our interests are very much opposed. Um, so I think we need to actually say, look, these are the things we want, and I think there's a very clear agreement, right? Like there shouldn't be homeless people. Everyone should be able to go to the doctor. Everyone should be able to go to college if they want to, right? You shouldn't be chained to a job, but everyone should be guaranteed one, right? Because not having a job is one of the great problems of capitalism, that capitalism does not provide a job for everyone, we need to change that. And I think this is a country where those kind of messages resonate, because this is a country where people appreciate labor, they appreciate that having a job, right? That's important,
That's what
uh,
every politician runs on, is jobs.
yeah, but they lie to us, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because they don't actually do that. So, I mean, I don't know. I think we're all figuring it out, I mean, like, for me, I've been a teacher for a long time, but I've only been kind of like a, minor media figure for a little while. I didn't always have a platform or whatever, I wasn't always the, Twitter's favorite communist professor. So, that's new. I think a lot of us are just trying to figure out what is the message that resonates with people, what is the shift in thinking? How do we get together and demand a society that is actually, what everyone says that they want, right? A society that works for everybody, right? And how do we really do that instead of just lie about it and have platitudes about it, which is, like what our politicians deliver.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it has to happen outside of partisan politics or maybe even electoral politics, just because, again, it seems as though that's what keeps kind of co-opting everyone and, getting us to fight as well, too. And I think that social media has been a major tool of that to get, family members just arguing about Trump or Biden, and not like focusing on things that might actually matter or impact their lives. So, I mean, would you agree? Do you think it really that if change is going to come, it has to happen outside of electoral politics?
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, electoral politics is, it's one element, but we've been encouraged to think of that as like everything. It's not everything, right? And it's not even in the top 50, like it's like we need to think about politics a lot more broadly, right? We need to talk about politics as like, you know, is your job unionized, right? Like if not, well, how would you go about doing that, right? Like, how about talking to your fellow workers, right? How about us getting together and just getting creative about what could this country be, right? Um, I think that's all politics, right? And voting is something we do every few years. Let's not act like that's the only thing. It's not. And if that's the only thing, then we're going to remain very weak.
Mm,
Um, we need to do politics every day, right? Not every 4 years.
absolutely. Well, Doctor, I really appreciate you being on the show today. For folks out there who would like to follow you and stay up to date with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is just my name. It's at Asatar Bair. Or you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. I have all my lectures that I give from my classes there. So if you want to learn macroeconomics or microeconomics, or you want to learn about political economy, which is kind of my code word for learning about socialism and communism and Marxism, um, I have all my lectures available on there. And I also teach meditation every week. So you're interested in that, check out my YouTube channel. Just type my name in there and it'll come right up.
Well, Dr. Asatar Bair, thank you again for being on the show today. I really do appreciate it, and hopefully I can have you back at some point in the future.
I'd enjoy that. Great conversation. Thanks so much for having me.